Time to answer the age-old question. Who watches The Watchmen and who watched Joker? And who the fuck cares? Joker and Watchmen, two of the most politically charged adaptations of comics to come out in 2019. Besides Captain Marvel, but I don't care about that movie, so we're not talking about that today. Or ever. What is interesting about covering these two stories in the same video is that they really do have a lot of similar issues going on with how they were treated by the media, and sort of where they diverge is how the topics that they covered, i.e. mental health, trauma, and race, were received by the people who were watching them. How Joker has become this darling of a certain section of the film society, super applauded by them, has so many nominations even though the critical reviews were very low, and was super controversial due to its racialized framing of the white mass shooter. In comparison, you have Watchmen, which is based on the Alan Moore and Dave Gibbons comic, which takes the alternate historical framing and instead of talking about the Cold War, uses it to talk about contemporary racial politics and issues going on in America today. Both of these stories had to deal with bad faith criticism, accusations of agendas, but one got review bombed and the other is a highly Oscar-nominated film. So I wanted to, in this video, sort of break down the elements of each that are interesting, frustrating, and the discussion of whose trauma actually gets to be seen as legitimate and valid in a superhero movie. Spoiler alert, it's the one with the white people in it. Who would have thought? So Joker is the 2019 psychological thriller directed, produced, and co-written by Todd Phillips with Scott Silver. It tells the story of Joaquin Phoenix's Arthur Flick, a cliche-riddled, mentally ill man who ends up starting a class war with Clown Antifa. But don't worry, Todd Phillips made it clear this movie is not political.
How about another joke, Murray?
No, I think we've had enough of your jokes.
What do you get?
I don't think so.
When you cross a mentally ill loner with a society that abandons him and treats him like trash!
Call the police,
I'll
Gene.
tell you what you get!
Call the police.
You get what you fucking deserve!
Okay, that's just us reading into it. The class warfare is just in our minds, kids. To me, Joker is not a good movie. I think that it's so aesthetically resonant and well acted that it elevates what's basically Scorsese fan fiction plus Batman mythos into this kind of hodgepodge fanboy interpretation of Joker. And as a, loose fan of the Batman character, but a big fan of DC and comics, dealing with Joker's origin story is just very boring to me. Just the idea of giving the Joker a backstory is a very boring idea. Even the guy that did the best version of it thinks his version was pretty pedantic right now. So just in general, the Joker, while an interesting, long-lasting character in the Batman mythos, what's interesting about him is how he interacts with Batman, not necessarily who he is as an individual. That's not really what's important to his character, in my humble opinion. Narratively, everything about everything about Arthur's character is frustrating to watch because the big fear that people had about the movie was that it would be emblematic of this narrative going on today about the white male mentally ill disenfranchised man who goes on to be a mass shooter. And basically in Joker, that's exactly who this character is. And was this movie the whole incel propaganda movie totally blown out of proportion? Absolutely. And the worst part of the entire propaganda around Joker of being an incel movie is that at the end of the day, the movie was just so dull and uninteresting that I think it ended up getting a lot more support than it would have gotten otherwise. The film doesn't add anything special or interesting to the Batman universe, and quite frankly, I think that Heath Ledger's Joker is more terrifying in that pencil scene that's so iconic from The Dark Knight than anything that Joaquin Phoenix does in this film, period. Watchmen is the HBO remix based on the Alan Moore and Dave Gibbons comic from 1987, aka one of the best things to ever be put to the page. I will be basic and say yes, I am a Watchmen stan. I have thought about getting a Dr. Manhattan tattoo, but I just don't want anyone to ever interact with me about it, so I just have chosen to not do that. It was created for television by Damon Lindelof, who was inspired by the article The Case for Reparations written by Ta-Nehisi Coates back in 2014. The research he did after reading the piece and wanting to take the ideas of how the OG Watchmen comic focused on the Cold War anxiety, but taking that and wanting to use it to talk about current racial tensions because, quote, to not tell a story about race in the context of a political text in 2019 almost felt borderline irresponsible. This version of Watchmen takes place 34 years after the comic series in an alternate future dealing with the aftermath of 11/2, aka the psychic alien squid attack on New York City, orchestrated by Adrian Veidt, aka my boy Ozymandias. Low-key love him, even though he's a mass murderer. He killed 3 million people and didn't go to jail. Somehow, not really that surprising. The show takes place primarily in Tulsa, Oklahoma, where a white supremacist group inspired by Rorschach's writing becomes known as the 7th Cavalry due to the issue of reparations that has been called Redfordations, alluding to Robert Redford, who was the president of the United States and has been president for a very long time. Because of the reparations, there's a lot of race-based terror. Cops wear masks now due to an attack that was put out against them called the White Knight. And our heroine, Detective Angela Abar, played by Regina the King, is retired on paper but is secretly the masked cop Sister Knight. Despite I think the show having a few pacing issues and wishing that we saw more of certain characters within the 9 episodes, I thought the series was fantastic. It was ambitious, it was thoughtful, and it really brought issues of Black trauma and Black mental health to the screen, something that I don't think that we get enough of, and it was done so well that I found myself really thinking, wow, it was so well done by a white showrunner. There's no excuse, white people. You can absolutely do the thing too. Speaking of mental health, we find out in the film that when Arthur was a baby, his mother allowed him to be abused, and it's implied that that abuse also included sexual violence by her boyfriends. His mother was mentally ill, lied about his father being Thomas Wayne, which is a whole thing in the movie that makes me really hate it so very, very much. One of the things you pick up if you listen to a lot of true crime podcasts is the idea of like the overbearing mentally ill mother is kind of a reoccurring figure plus an abusive father or an absentee father combined with an already existing mental illness or trauma-based condition. So in Joker, Arthur suffers from this kind of pathological laughter, which leads him to kind of laugh in situations that are otherwise serious or awkward. It's been interesting because when I've spoken to people who like this movie, especially if they are young white men, the thing that they like about the movie is how the film
shines a light on mental illness.
As a mentally ill person, I'm gonna respectfully disagree on that. And what I think is so troubling about the depiction of Flick is that there is sort of this one-to-one correlation in the film between him being mentally ill and becoming the Joker.
I'm cheering up.
Oh, that's sweet. But, no, I feel good. I stopped taking my medication. I feel a lot better now.
According to mental health statistics, 1 in 25 Americans have lived with a serious mental illness such as schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, or major depression. The vast majority of people with mental health problems are no more likely to be violent than anyone else. Most people with mental illnesses are nonviolent, and only 3 to 5% of violent acts can be attributed to individuals living with a serious mental illness. In fact, people with severe mental illnesses are over 10 times more likely to be victims of violent crime than the general population. This is a very important thing because with all of the media talking about mental illness and how you need to take care of mentally ill people to avoid school shootings, it ignores the fact that the reality for mentally ill people is not that they will become school shooters, is that they will live in probably poverty or abusive situations. Most people who are mentally ill are not terrorists or killers, yet when looking for the inspiration for bringing joy to life, Joaquin Phoenix wrote a book about political assassinations. He told Variety, I wanted the freedom to create something that wasn't identifiable, and we want to have the room to create what we want. It can't be a film about highlighting mental illness When it isn't concerned about doing any of the exploration on mental illness, doing the work, trying to make it authentic, it's interested in the aesthetic of what it means to be mentally ill to create a dark nihilistic character, which I think right now is not just not interesting, but also somewhat irresponsible. Mental health and trauma also play a really big role in Watchmen, mostly in the forms of generational trauma and PTSD. With Angela and her grandfather character, Will Reeves, you are exploring Black American trauma post-slavery Jim Crow up until now. And the other trauma that you get to experience is the trauma of 11/12. 3 million people died and countless others were injured and left with PTSD. During a group meeting for anxiety, a young man expressed the fact that his mother was hit with a major psychic blast, and he feels that even though he was born several years later, that he carries her pain and her anxiety from that moment.
There's this thing, genetic trauma. Basically, if something really bad happens to your parents, it gets locked into their DNA. So when my mom got hit by the blast, even though I wasn't born until 10 years after 11/2, it's like I inherited her pain.
Wade, the masked cop, known as Looking Glass, was in New Jersey during the attack and walked out to the sea of dead bodies and lives in perpetual fear of the next big attack. While one is based on fictional events and one based on historical trauma, both of these stories show how men and women who are not able to heal in healthy ways devolve into the worst versions of themselves. William ends up pushing his family away and trying to punch his rage away, and leaving behind a son who grows up without a father. Wade has several failed marriages and relationships because he keeps thinking that something terrible is going to happen and cannot heal from it.
You have your pick of good women, so why do you keep getting mixed up with the ones that are just gonna kick you in the balls?
I picked you. You're a good woman.
And for 7 years, I tried to convince you that I wasn't gonna run off with your clothes and leave you naked all by yourself.
Both of these men are seen to be in pain, troubled, and deeply imperfect. However, you also see the humanity behind them. Wade is trying to help other survivors despite not being completely whole himself. William is a very good man. He's just deeply traumatized by race.
You worried about me?
They gave you a gun and a stick. That's what I'm worried about. What you gonna do with them? Because you are an angry, angry man, William Reeves.
He doesn't revel in doing violence. He thinks and wants to bring justice to Black communities who have nowhere else to be. His rage is perfectly viable and meaningful. The problem is that he doesn't know how to pull it back. Doing it that way is how you end up with nuanced depictions of mental health, not by turning it into kind of voyeuristic pornography, but allowing it to be based in truth, even if you are trying to create your own thing. All right, let's get dangerous and talk about race. Yeah, you know that's my beat, guys. That's what I do. That's why you come back, to tell me that I'm a dumb race baiter. Race Bader Ginsburg, baby. There are 3 non-white characters in Joker. 1 mean, nameless Black woman on the bus. 2, his caseworker who cannot help him. And 3, Zazie Beetz' character who doesn't have a name in the film but is Arthur's love interest and is pretty much in a glorified cameo the entire time. She could have filled her 1 or 2 Atlanta episodes in the time it took her to do this damn production, but you know, whatever. Despite the fact that this is a story that is crafted around urban living and urban trauma, and if you look at the script for Joker, they even make notes about him being one of the few white people in his neighborhood. How relevant, I guess. The podcast Still Processing by New York Times culture writers Jenna Wortham and Wesley Morris had an episode titled Psycho Bros, where it talked about the portrayal of mental illness and masculinity in works like Joker and Fight Club and Succession. Wesley Morris during the podcast makes the following point. Society's collapse affects him, and part of his illness is that he doesn't think that anybody can see him, and that he doesn't matter, which for any non-white person in the audience, you just kind of want to have a little chuckle. This chuckle that Morris is talking about is how when it comes to mental health and illnesses, overwhelmingly in the media you are showing white people, particularly white men, dealing with those issues, despite the fact that, quote, ethnic and racial minorities often bear a disproportionately high burden of disability resulting from mental disorders, and also, quote, people from racial ethnic minority groups are less likely to receive mental health care. Did my research for this video. Thanks for that Patreon support, guys. Part of what is so ungroundbreaking about Joker is just how it really reinforces a narrative that's already been examined in many other good movies. We rarely see movies about mentally ill women that aren't psychological sexual thrillers or revenge stories about, you know, like Gone Girl, which is wunderbar, you know? We are just now getting to a point where we're seeing Black and Latinx people going to therapy in media. Joker is sadly just not breaking the wheel, and yet there is so much attention for being so gritty and real, but it's not ever trying to do anything real. I'd highly recommend that if you haven't read The Case for Reparations by Ta-Nehisi Coates, that you do check it out. It really highlights the financial realities of what was stolen from Black American people and how it affects them to this day. Watchmen opens, as many of you know, with the Black Wall Street Massacre in Tulsa, a scene that for many was the first time that they'd ever heard of that event, Black or otherwise. We see a young William Reeves in 1921 being orphaned by that violence and witnessing the death of his parents and a countless number of other people who look like him. That trauma was embedded into the very psyche of his personhood. As an adult in New York City, he is nearly lynched by his own cop co-workers after he becomes one of two, we can presume, Black police officers in the North. And it is that near lynching and the hood that he wore that makes him want to reclaim that identity and become Hooded Justice, tying him into the original Watchmen comic. While the show is specifically dealing with the Black American experience as an American-born Black person, I also see this as touching on the trauma that is collected within a lot of African descendant people that never gets to be seen in the media. Whether it be the chattel slavery that took place in the Americas and the Caribbean, or the colonization that took place in Africa, or the slaughter that took place across the continent here, it is that trauma of generations of people of your family having come from something being disenfranchised, something that I'm sure a lot of Native American, Indigenous, Aboriginal, Pacific Islander people can understand. What I love about Watchmen is the way it speaks truth to the pain that often goes unsaid and ignored. You know, how do you quantify generations of disenfranchisement? Like, how do you explain how your parents passed down love, but also immense trauma in the way that they raised us, you know? How many of us talk about how we won't be as violent as our parents, but have still been taught to see the benefit of that violence in teaching children? And I found that Watchmen somehow managed to plug into the trauma of an entire ethnic group of Black people and just acknowledge it and treat it like it mattered. And that was so refreshing and beautiful and inclusive. And honestly, the fact that Watchmen is one of my favorite comics and this remix has done that has made it mean so much more for me, because it was a thoughtful way of connecting a modern story to a classic comic, which is why I think it's such a great adaptation of the comic in the first place. We sadly live in an era where we will have multiple comic book adaptations in several forms, regardless of if we need them or not, and I'm certain that we fucking don't need them. So it is important to ask what is gained by having all of these adaptations come to life. All the money that is being put into this and not, say, another season of Anne with an E. I'm not burned by that. Now, before I get started, I feel like there is something I need everyone out there to hear, and it's really important, and some of you really need to hear this, so I'm going to say this very clearly. Alan Moore doesn't like you. Now hold on to that. It will be important later. In the lifetimes that we have had, there have been many amazing, good, and I would say only one bad, really, version of the Joker. He's one of the most consistently adapted villains and has been used mostly well. Mostly. So why pick to adapt that character? Sir, the answer is clout. When I was doing my little research, looking up how Silver and Phillips came up with their version of the Joker, It said that they pushed each other every day to come up with something totally insane and drew upon, quote, elements from the 1988 graphic novel Batman the Killing Joke. Wow, how fucking new. Whoa, The Killing Joke? The most obscure Joker comic of all time? God damn, y'all got deep. And they looked at The Killing Joke and a handful of other sources, and they kind of decided that they didn't want to do the whole chemical vat thing because, quote, I don't believe that in the real world, if you fell into a vat of acid, you would turn white and have a smile and your hair would be green. So you start backwards engineering these things and it becomes really interesting. Imagine you're working on one of the most prolific comic book characters of all time and you read one book and a handful of sources. Y'all really just let white people make these comic books even though they don't know shit about comics. Like, it's truly, you give people of color and women so much shit for even daring to talk about comics, but these people don't know shit about comics, but you let them get their nerd money so easily. You hate to see it, truly. Mind you, this is not about comic book purism for me. Like, I love the Joker, but that's not my man, you know? But I do think it's funny that this man basically doesn't care about the source material, but is gonna get the nerd Oscar for it. But you know, go off, I guess. To do a Joker movie with no real intention of adding anything to Batman mythology just seems ludicrous to me. Like, if you want to do something different, obviously we need that, that's fine, but like, let's be real, if you wanted to actually do something different and interesting, you would have picked a less adapted Batman villain. You would have picked like Clayface, the Riddler, Mad Hatter. You picked the Joker because you're like, wouldn't it be interesting to do the backstory of the Joker? No. No one cares. And if you knew anything about Batman, you would know we don't care. Throughout the entire miniseries, Watchmen attempts to weave a story that is interwoven with the original story while staying true to the realities of what Watchmen was trying to do. Watchmen was created by its authors to reflect contemporary anxieties at that time and to also deconstruct and play with superhero concept, which is exactly what Watchmen is doing, but centering it around Black American issues first. And the main thing I think is really powerful is that they said that Watchmen endeavors to unearth that part of our collective history that has been ignored or omitted, like the Tulsa 1921 in the pilot. These are all parts of African American history, and obviously by extension, therefore straight up American history, that have been given the short shrift. And that's what's got everyone so shook. Black stories are denied the ability to be universal, to be actual narratives, to be storytelling vehicles, you know? They always have to come with an agenda, you know? They always have to come with an idea that like, it's to teach you a lesson. Like, yes, you have learned something about Black American history by watching Watchmen, but it's also a show too. What's even more clear is that the writers of Watchmen really loved the comic, you can tell, and like, they really wanted to create something that worked within it, including the giant squid. Okay, so it does work and it is terrifying because I know I would not want to see that calamari in my face. And by creating a version of Watchmen that understands the politics of Alan Moore, both when he wrote it and today, you end up getting all this weird backlash because you're addressing both sides, and you end up with people who don't realize Alan Moore doesn't like you. Here's some little details that you need to remember about the original comic. The graphic novel is dealing with several different moral and political viewpoints, and the characters are supposed to be the vehicles in which we examine those viewpoints and those fears. Night Owl is Blue Beetle, the comedian is Peacemaker with a little bit of, you know, Nick Fury, Dr. Manhattan is Captain Atom, Silk Spectre is a little bit of Black Canary, Ozymandias is Thunderbolt, and Rorschach is Mr. A, the touch of the question. And most of these characters were created by Mr. Steve Ditko, who is a very important person in comics. So let's do a little Ditko detour here. Ditko helped co-create Spider-Man and Doctor Strange. What's relevant to this video is that he was an Ayn Rand fan and believed in objectivism, and he created the character of Mr. A to reflect those political beliefs. Alan Moore, in comparison, is an occultist, magician, anarchist wizard. which means Alan Moore doesn't like you. To use his own words, I had to look at the fountainhead. I have to say I found Ayn Rand's philosophy laughable. It was a white supremacist dreams of the master race burnt in a 20th century form. Her ideas didn't really appeal to me, but you know who does like Ayn Rand? Zack Snyder. So now you understand why that fucking movie is so bad. Despite being a shot for shot, except for the ending adaptation, it's not good because Zack Snyder doesn't get the political issues going on in Watchmen because he's not actually that tuned into comics at all. Does this mean that you can't like Rorschach or that Rorschach isn't a good character? No. Just because Moore is on a different political sphere than that character doesn't mean that he didn't make Rorschach a dynamic, fleshed out character. He is a good writer, writing about several flawed moral ideologies. There is no right one. That's literally the point of Watchmen. Plus, you know, Ditko was still an important person in Moore's life in terms of comic education. Just because they're politically different doesn't mean that he's unable to communicate the ideas in the text. What makes him so prolific and important is that he can do that, and you don't know which side he's on, although part of the fun is guessing, and I have my guesses, but I will not share them today because there's not a debate about that. What's most important is that this Watchman understands Moore today, more so than who Moore was then. Because the thing about Moore is that he doesn't really love his book as much because he never wanted Watchmen, the gritty deconstructionist kind of idea of Watchmen, to become a genre, let alone a genre that took over comics for a long time and is still dealing with it today. Which is why the optimistic ending of the Watchmen HBO series is the best tribute to the comic, because that is the kind of thing that he would have made today if he could have. Because Watchmen is not just a deconstruction, it is a celebration of comic book lore and history. And so the HBO series is a celebration of Watchmen and what it meant to comic book history. It even references Superman within the text, and it's an immigrant and a black person talking about it because that is who Superman is.
What's it about? A boy, a baby. His father puts him in a rocket ship and sends him to Earth just before his planet explodes.
Are you going to? We're gonna be right behind you.
And it's so good, and they understand it, and I love it, and that's why it's a good show. And Joker is trash because no one cares about the text. I need more hot chocolate. You have to love comics to be able to make good comic content. Hot take. One of the really frustrating things about trying to bring more diversity into professional criticism is that when people are marginalized, talk about being turned off by something, they often get told, maybe this isn't for you. And the concept of certain media not being for someone, at least in my knowledge, came from black women, of course, responding to non-black, mostly white women, attempting to inject their criticism into black art, into black feminism without understanding the intricacies of our own art. I remember this coming up with Bitch Better Have My Money by Rihanna and Lemonade by Beyonce, with certain white women going like, I don't get it. And it's like, yes, it's not for you in a sense of it saying that you don't have taste inherently or like whatever like that. What it meant was sometimes because you are not aware of certain cultural nuances, you do not have the equipment, you do not have the range to understand the significance of this thing. Does not mean that black women can't objectively look at Lemonade and be like, not really for me, or break it down to what is good and bad about it. But it does mean that if you do not understand the significance of something culturally, it can sometimes hinder your ability to consume a certain piece of media. That's just important. Like, A Wrinkle in Time did have a lot of sort of like social importance. Still a bad movie, in my humble opinion, but I did understand why a black director would want to make a movie like that, even if I don't like the end product. When I wrote my review of Joker for the Mary Sue, which I think is actually a very good piece of writing, by the way, someone suggested that maybe Joker wasn't for me. I noted that, you know, YouTube reviewer Chris Stuckman like the film. And to me, what I hated about this kind of like feedback was that, first of all, there's nothing about the Joker that's above my cultural knowledge. I have mental illness. I live in New York. You know, I also had suicide attempts. I also have negative thoughts all the time. What about it? I read comics. I know who the Joker is. And yeah, come at me, bruh. And I think the Chris Stuckman comparison is extra funny because I like Chris Stuckman. I actually interviewed him once. And while he's a few years older than me, like, and also much more successful than I am, we're both nerds, both YouTubers, both love the Angelina Jolie Lara Croft movies. We both have anime tattoos. And most importantly, we're both Aries. He's just a white man from Ohio, and I'm a queer black woman from Brooklyn. We intersect on enough issues that where we divert is often a matter of taste and preference. He's not more inclined to like Joker because he's white, and I'm not more inclined to hate it because I'm black. Black people love the Joker. Ask your black friend, they'll confirm it for you. I just think the movie is bad. And the people behind the movie couldn't answer basic topical questions about why the movie was getting the direction it was getting. And I don't have an agenda. I have thoughts. I have an opinion. And also, who follows movie reviews that they agree with 100% of the time? I certainly don't. I at least listen to Spill.com just to disagree with them because I'm like, y'all don't even get Sucker Punch. Also, I like Sucker Punch, so I get liking bad films. And I'm not saying you can't enjoy Joker, but I'm just saying, like, let's not pretend as if it's moving the envelope when it ain't even giving you a paper cut. When it comes down to it, why I love Watchmen, boop, and find Joker exhausting doesn't actually have to do with race. You know, I mostly think that it has to do with the fact that Joker as a film is so painfully stuck in the past, and Watchmen feels like the future. Philip said that the Joker's not political, and I'm like, that's bullshit to me. Like, there is a certain sense that I get from watching the movie that there's a fear of being truly divisive, of being truly gritty. You know, Watchmen isn't for everyone because it is different. It is telling a different kind of story. It's taking risks. It's not always an easy show to get into. Joker as a concept, as a story, especially if it wants to be insane and crazy, it's fundamentally safe. It adds no nuance to the thriller genre, doesn't add anything interesting to the Batman mythology. It's just the perfect combination of politically negligent and boring. Watchmen isn't perfect, but it was ambitious, and that makes it the far better experience watching it, both as a fan of comics and someone who watches way too many shows to be impressed by the bare bones of white male tragedy. I care about white men. I want good things for you, but like in the world where we have been given BoJack Horseman, Joker ain't doing nothing for the whites. Joker is selling y'all short. And honestly, if there wasn't this feeling of political difference, of like, we have to root for Joker because we gotta pwn the libs, I don't think it would have done well. And I think if anything, the other lesson I've gotten from this entire experience is like, stop elevating douchebaggery, you know? Turning Joker into a phenomenon is the fault of the media. Like, yours truly included, because I did write about it, and I tried to talk about my genuine concerns about it because they were genuine concerns, but like when it was like, we have security at these press screenings, I was like, y'all, like, this is a lot. This is a movie starring Joaquin Phoenix by the maker of Due Date. Anyway, I would love to hear your thoughts on Watchmen Joker, how you feel about the film, how you think it talks about mental illness, trauma, all those different kind of things. I hope you enjoyed this video. I really worked hard on it. I can't wait to share with you. And of course, thank you so much to my patrons who have been patiently waiting for me to put this up. You guys are amazing. Thank you for your support. I have a surprise coming out for you guys soon. I'm getting postcards, stickers made, baby, with art of me as a Klingon, as Sailor Moon, and as Black Canary. More information to come. Why am I like this? Please like and subscribe. The feedback for the Laredo video has been so great, and everyone who watched the Slave Play video, even though it wasn't important to y'all, thank you to you guys too. I love making content that is both topical and timely, and also just stuff that I enjoy. That'll never change about Millennia Pen. That will never change about me. So the next long video that I'm going to do will be about Witcher. Toss a coin to your Witcher, oh mommy, you plenty, oh mommy, you plenty. Stay tuned.
I think that we send a very clear message to people of color that you're not welcome here. This is not a self-righteous condemnation, because I'm ashamed to say that I'm part of the problem. I think that it is the obligation of the people that have created and perpetuate and benefit from a system of oppression to be the ones that dismantle it. So that's on us.